Well, I had plans to speak on something different this evening, but for the last 3 Sunday evenings, we've been looking at passages in the Old Testament where the wall between them and Calvary seems absolutely paper thin. And Isaiah 53, the suffering servants, Psalm 22, David speaking Christ's cry of dereliction on the cross. And it strikes me there's plenty more passages where we read them and we are led to Calvary. And Lamentations 3 is one of those. Now, just a few kind of comments on Lamentations. A lament is sorrow, sadness, expressing pain or sorrow, grief, mourning. Often in the Christian repertoire, we expect always songs of joy, and songs of joy are food for salvation. And yet the Bible gives us this other language, this language of lament. Often there's psalms of laments. I can remember once playing my family just some blues music, some old blues music on YouTube. And there are these people pouring out their hearts. And they think, wow, I can remember somebody asking a question, what are they sad about? What are they singing about? And the Bible's got the blues in it. The Bible's got songs of sorrow and sadness and lament. Lamentations has 5 songs of sorrow, and they're all to do with the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. If you just put yourself in that position, there, the people of Judah, because of the unfaithfulness of Israel and their idolatry against the Lord, they have overstepped the mark. And so the Lord had warned in the book of Deuteronomy that he would bring curse on them for their sins, exclusion from the land. And finally, with the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians, that happens. The prophet Jeremiah had prophesied about that destruction. He'd warned the people. Jeremiah was the weeping prophet, the prophet of suffering. And many people think that Lamentations is based around Jeremiah's eyewitness testimony as he looks at the destruction of Jerusalem. And although the writer is not named, I think there's a lot of helpfulness in that here we have eyewitness and yet great poetic capture of the day of the Lord, the day of God's wrath, a day of great sorrow, exclusion from God's presence, weeping and mourning. And as I read to you, some of that imagery is very, very graphic indeed. So sometimes it's the if you like, the people of Israel as a whole who are speaking or singing the songs, talking about how Zion is mourning, how her foes have come, how the Lord has taken all support away, how he's rightly angry with them. And sometimes, particularly here in chapter 3, you get an individual, a representative person speaking about the sorrows of Israel as if he represents them. It could be the prophet Jeremiah, it could be a particular person, it could be Israel, saying, look, I am the man who's seen affliction. We've been brought under the rod of his wrath. God has turned his hand against us. Our bones are broken. We're enduring bitterness. We're shut out so we cannot escape. We're knowing grief and anxious. And God has become their adversary in his anger. He's like a bear lying in wait for me, or a target of his anger. Their sufferings are terrible at that time. And yet, you can't just take this chapter out and just put it on the cross and all the details fall in. And yet, there's something going on here that speaks of Jesus Christ and points forward to him. Do you remember Mark's account of the cross? Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. Let me find it. Mark chapter 15. And Mark says there, and we've seen this already from Isaiah and Psalm 22, but it's here as well. Here we are. Mark chapter 15. And those who passed by, this is verse 29, derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So you get people passing by, shaking their heads, passing by the cross, mocking Christ. Well, Lamentations chapter 1, verse 12. "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by, and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger." And then chapter 2, verse 15 to 16. "All who pass along the way clap their hands, they hiss and wag their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all the earth? All your enemies rail against you." The similarities in language there are really quite striking, aren't they? Incredible. So what's going on? Well, Jesus' death, when he dies outside of Jerusalem, if you like, there's a lens being put over it by the gospel writers. They want us to look at Jesus' death in the light of the destruction of Jerusalem. That Jesus is like the abandoned, forsaken city. People are passing by and mocking him. He has been handed over to the Gentiles as the Romans hurt him. He is under the wrath of God. And so when you read Lamentations 3, this is pointing us forward to the sufferings of Christ. And just as Isaiah 53 shows us sufferings and triumph, Psalm 22 shows us suffering and hope, we get suffering and comfort, suffering and hope here as well. So just two verses I want to bring to you. Verse 19, "Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall." So this great sufferer, representing God's people, Jerusalem, wants us to remember the sufferings that the people have been through, the bitterness of their sufferings. And he continually remembers it and is bowed down. His soul is bowed down. They are humbled because of their sufferings. And we might say, if there were any sufferings to remember, there were the sufferings that these words point forward to, the sufferings of Christ. Now, there's too few of us in the room to sing this song, but I'm sure many of you here tonight have sung. Is it by Edwin Mote? "Oh, hail the power of Jesus' name." You know that. "Ye Gentile sinners, never forget the wormwood and the gall." So that's old-fashioned hymn language, taking Lamentations 3 and using that for the sufferings of Christ. Remember the afflictions of Christ. Remember what he suffered for you. Remember what he did in your place. Remember it. And it humbles us. Now, not every day is a Lamentations 3 day. Not every day in the Christian life is a day of darkness and despair. And yet when we look at the cross and how the sufferings of God's people find their answer in the sufferings of Christ on the cross in their place, when we are in darkness, we have hope. Remember the sufferings of Christ. I read a book about Christian ministers. I didn't read it all. I read the first 2 chapters. I had to put it down because it's really strong. A Christian minister's experience of depression. And not all Christians feel times of depression and darkness, but a good many do. And this man was talking about, because of a trauma, an experience of feeling far from God, not just far, but God was completely distant. And he talks about how what he really held on to was the songs of lament in the Psalms, that a God that could allow the Psalms to be written in the Bible was not a God I could dismiss. And it's incredible, isn't it? The lament, and particularly we'd put with the Psalms of the Bible, Lamentations, here is a God who understands, who wants us to understand what it is to feel forsaken and abandoned. And even that, he is the God of Golgotha and Calvary that we can hang on to. So that's the first thing. Remember my afflictions. And then I love these words, verse 21. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. So there's a deliberate act of remembering something. And because of this, in the middle of suffering, this individual has hope. And we might say that the Lord Jesus, in the sufferings he placed on the cross, he's the ultimate lamenter. He's the ultimate singer of lamentations. He remembered his Father. Even in his suffering, Jesus, as we saw last week, the ultimate believer who trusted the Lord, had hope. And the hope is God's steadfast love is never consumed. God's steadfast love, his covenant commitment to his people, never, ever, ever, ever runs out. Even when his people are disciplined, even when we are knowing times of difficulty and suffering and pain, his steadfast love never, ever, ever comes to an end. In the NIV, I think, because of God's great love, we are not consumed, is the other way this verse could be put. His mercies never come to an end. And so every morning there are new mercies. Every morning there are new things to see. That doesn't mean, every day you leap out of bed with a spring in your step singing, oh, what a wonderful morning, or you're like Cinderella and the birds come and tweet to you while you're singing and you're making your breakfast. It doesn't mean every day is like that, but it means that in every day there is something to see of God and his faithfulness and his goodness. His faithfulness is great. And therefore this singer can say, the Lord is my portion. So not God's blessings, not God's favours, but the Lord himself is my reward. That's what I want. Therefore I will hope in him. And if Jesus Christ knew hope even in the darkness of the cross, that means we can too. In fact, we can see that Jesus Christ, he took the place of us on the cross. He took the curse. He bore the wormwood and the gall. He knew what it was to face the judgment of God, so that ultimately we would never be consumed, that we would be loved and forgiven. His faithfulness is great. She advocates a seeking of God, a humbling of him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Let him sit alone in silence, bearing suffering, looking to the Lord who is faithful. And verse 31 to verse 33 are amazing, aren't they? For the Lord will not cast off forever. Do you remember Jesus saying, whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. Though he causes grief, the Lord's, as Christian people, we never face ultimate judgments. He can correct us, he can discipline us, but he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. Verse 33 is an incredible verse. The Puritans thought about this verse a lot. He does not afflict from his heart. So that when we face suffering and sorrow as God's people, what he delights in is to show us mercy and grace. That's his heart. That's who he is. That his afflictions are to humble us and to refine us. So, as we look at this and we're pointed to Calvary, we can remember the depth of sorrow and suffering Christ in our place. And we can call to mind that his steadfast love never ceases. And therefore we have hope.